Okay. A very good afternoon to everyone. This is Samar Perwez here, and I'll be a moderator for today. I'm a student of grade 12 at Lilibati High School, and I was always fascinated by technology and the potential it has to transform our world. So, in this panel, Tech for Good, we will be discussing about the ethics and the problems being faced by today's digital world and gain a deeper insight into the industry. We are graced with the esteemed presence of two of the stalwarts of their industries, Ms. Nidhi Ravi and Mr. Jagrit Surisetti, as our panelists for today. I'll now hand it over to you to introduce yourselves.
Hi, everyone. I am Nidhi Ravi. I just graduated from BITS Pilani Goa campus with a double major in economics and computer science. I am currently working as an analyst at Dalberg Advisors, which is an impact consulting firm and focuses on the development sector. And before this, I spent a year at Amazon Machine Learning as an applied scientist intern. I've also been very fascinated about the use of tech for good, and I've also done a lot of research work related to that. So I'm very excited to be here and have this discussion.
Yeah, that's great. So we'll begin with the first question. We have gradually transitioned into a data-driven world, which is characterized by humongous amounts of personal data. Nidhi, with your experience at Dalberg, you must have undoubtedly managed vast amounts of consumer data. So how do you handle the data and what are the common problems as faced? Also, what will be your suggestions and recommendations for data privacy and data protection? For example, GDPR for the EU.
Okay, so that's a good question. So before I really answer that, let me just take a step back and talk about why data and personalized data is really important for both the consumer and big companies, as well as in the social impact space as well. So coming from Dalberg, we work in the development sector where data is it is a very data poor space and data is very important. And I understand the need for large amounts of data because using that we can make more better decisions and more impactful decisions. And even when we look at big tech companies, for the company itself, having personalized data and curating content for the consumer maximizes their own profit. But also from the consumer side, it does improve our experience on these platforms as well. For example, I have personally benefited from recommendations on Netflix to advertisements and recommendations on Instagram and Facebook and suggestions on what to buy at Amazon. So having this kind of like large amounts of personalized data is important, and it is going to be there, right, in the world. There's no stopping that. So what we need to do is make sure that our personal data is safe and secure, right? We need to make sure that it's being handled with care. So this really becomes a problem in situations like a hacked system. For example, Domino's was hacked recently and a lot of personal data was released. And I know that even data such as people's addresses and phone numbers were publicly available. And this is a huge problem because it's a threat to our actual physical security as well. And so one of the things is that it's really important to have a secure database and a secure system. And I know that a lot of big companies have that because they can afford it and they do spend a lot of time and money doing that. But a lot of the smaller companies that have our personal data, they don't have this kind of security system. And so we do need like larger regulations in place to make sure that our data is safe. And the other thing is anonymization of data. So for example, companies can encrypt things like your name, your phone number, things that are actually identifiers. They can encrypt that so that even though the company can make personalized recommendations for you and they can store your data and use it to make impactful decisions, they don't actually know who you are. And so your identity cannot be compromised and it cannot lead to things like theft and fraud. So I think these are two things that they are being implemented to some extent, but there is a need for large scale regulation to make sure that our privacy is and security is maintained.
Yeah, Jagrit, you can introduce yourself and then contribute. So your introduction is still there.
Oh, yeah. So, hi, I'm Jagrit Surisetti. I am the founder of a digital well-being solution called Apprison. It's available on Play Store. It primarily works towards ensuring that people are empowered to improve their smartphone usage as opposed to being afraid of it. Yeah. And could you please repeat the question?
Yeah, I'll repeat the question for you. We have gradually transitioned into a data-driven world, which is characterized by humongous amounts of personal data. Jagrit, with your experience of founding an app Apprison, you must have undoubtedly managed vast amounts of consumer data. So how do you handle that data and what are the common problems as per you? Also, what will be your suggestions and recommendations for data privacy and data protection? For example, in the EU, we have GDPR.
Yeah. So to the first part of your question, I think there are two stakeholders in this entire issue. That's what I've learned from running Apprison and other such technology solutions. The first is the consumer or the customer, and the second is the creators. Right? On the consumer front, it's a matter of not being negligent, is what I feel. Right? In terms of, there are privacy policies that companies put out, but nobody cares to read it. Right? You just scroll down and you just press OK. But that's basically just neglecting the solution that already exists, in a sense, to give you an idea of how your privacy is being dealt with or how your data is being dealt with. So irrespective of how many laws or whatever the government does to force creators or app providers to ensure that their data is compliant with whatever law format that the country has, as long as people are not going to stop neglecting the idea that they're supposed to be aware of what their data is being used for, it simply fails at that point. Right. So the first thing is consumers need to take an active step in ensuring that they are more active towards learning about how data is being used. That's the first thing. The second thing about the creators or the solution providers is that, as Nidhi rightly said, there are ideas like encryption around, like you can have data, you can store data and use it to provide solutions to them or improve the solutions that you provide to them. But if you encrypt it, nobody else has access to it. That's the core idea behind encryption. And I think with the introduction of Web 3.0 and things like blockchain, which rely totally on encryption, that's basically encryption only, I think encryption is going to become a norm. And as we move towards a decentralized internet or a decentralized network of solutions, it is going to become something that's readily accessible to a lot more solution providers and not as technologically distant as it would seem. And finally, I think that it's always humans behind tech is what I believe in. So if you are thinking about how data is being used, it's a matter of the creators and consumers having a good intent towards data. So if the creators use the data for good, it is the final check that is required, right? That I ensure that as a creator or as a solution provider, I provide a solution which does not breach privacy of data and keeps data in good faith. Because I think trust and faith are going to be the future of tech human relationship in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely agree. So in order to further build the trust, do you think that companies should have something like an informed consent in which they state what data will be used, how will it be used, and why they're collecting it? So should you think such a thing should become mandatory for each and every company so that the users themselves can make an informed consent?
Absolutely. See, the thing about this is that when you look at, let's say, Europe's GDPR, or India is coming up with a bill of its own, which is like privacy data program or bill or something like that. The key idea behind that is that when you think about whether it worked in Europe or not, all companies were facing one major problem, and that is economics. So it was taking up a lot of money. It was a huge cost to make sure that the data that they have is compliant with the norms that have been set. Right. So while you can have a privacy protection policy or a law in place, the key thing to note is the practicality of that law. which is to say that the moment I'm looking at implementing such a law, it needs to be feasible for all stakeholders that exist right now. That being said, when I look at India as a place where a law like this could exist, it has a very unique characteristic present in it that's not there in the rest of the world, which is people and culture. Right. So I'll give you an example. There was a team in IIT Delhi who were working on making a machine learning tool for traffic analysis. Right. And what they found was that while it was giving 80% or something like that accuracy in the UK, the accuracy fell down to 20% in India, because they have seen such bizarre things happening in India, like people driving over a footpath, a motorcycle taking over a footpath to cross the road. That's something that almost does not happen in the rest of the world. Right. So very important thing to keep note of when making a policy like this for India is that it needs to consider the unique characteristics of India, is what I feel. Yeah.
If I could just add to that, I completely agree with what you said. But the other thing is that if you look at a company's privacy policy, like how many of us have actually read WhatsApp's privacy policy?
Mm-hmm.
It is so long and it's full of jargon. It's very difficult to understand. And particularly in a country like India, there is a need for these policies and all of everything that comes with it to be accessible to everyone, whatever their level of education is. And so I think even in the research work that I did, which was actually related to the domestic violence policy, a lot of people were not aware of it. A lot of people were not aware of how they could get help. And so similarly with privacy, there's a need to really educate people about it. There is a need to make policies as easy to understand as possible. And I think that also needs to come from the government level. Yeah, that's something that I feel pretty strongly about, because us being in tech, I haven't read a lot of companies' privacy policies myself. So yeah, there is definitely a need for that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yes, that was great. So I guess now we can move on to the next question. In recent times, AI has taken the world by storm. However, it has brought its own set of challenges. One common issue that I feel is important is that of unknowingly incorporating human biases while developing AI and machine learning algorithms. For example, recently in 2018, Amazon built an AI recruiting tool that was trained using the past 10 years of resumes submitted to Amazon. This AI model was not gender neutral. It heavily favored men because of the male dominance that was prevalent in the industry. Now, obviously, this is not acceptable. Because the model was trained on flawed data, it had those inherent flaws with it. So could you throw some light on this by sharing with us your experience? And also, do you think that such a bias can be eliminated or not?
So that's a really good point. I think it is no secret that STEM and tech is a very male-dominated field, and that bias does actually exist in society, right? It's not just AI that picks it up. AI is actually a reflection of society itself, and it is a reflection of all the historical biases that have existed. And bias related to gender is one of them. So I think even if you Google programmer, on Google Images, you will find images of men. And if you Google nurse, you will find images of women. And I actually did this yesterday because I thought these kinds of things should be eliminated by now. But obviously, it is a reflection of reality, right? Because, for example, in college, in my computer science class, only 10% were women. That's actually why we founded BITS Goa Women in Tech in the first place. So I think what we need to do is be very cognizant of the fact that AI does look very strongly at historical information, historical data, and make predictions based on that. I think that awareness is the first step. And I do believe that providing the right context is really important. Like, for example, if a CV actually had the gender or has gendered words, then those can be removed before actually providing it, or either removed or kind of contrasted with the other gendered word before actually providing it to the algorithm. So that level of bias is kind of removed. So providing context and adding these additional features to AI algorithms is a very critical step in removing this bias.
Yeah, absolutely. Bang on, man. I mean, this is absolutely true. While I'm no judge of how the society is like, because I am like in a space where it does not necessarily affect. But what I've recognized is that when I look at history, this bias is something that is inculcated in our head even without us knowing it, right? So you can take any form of bias for that matter, and I'll give you a very simple example. What does the word sinister mean? For a lot of people, for everybody who has studied English, sinister is associated with bad, evil, doom, that kind of stuff. But if you go into the etymology of the word sinister, it just means left, to the left side. That's as simple as what it meant originally and how it got misconstrued to mean evil, doom, whatever the cause might have been. And we are also using that word without recognizing the kind of bias that is existent in the history of it. Now, we as humans who study language, who look at all of this, who are taught the language, are making such mistakes. How can we expect a system like an artificial intelligence based, machine learning based tool to understand so much historical context with just data? Right? It simply cannot work. There are so many biases that are existent in the data that we given, that it simply is not something that you can remove from the systems that learn from that data. It's as simple as that. It's like a tech tool is like a kid, right? Like father, like son, like mother, like daughter, whatever that may be. But the apple doesn't fall really far from the tree. And so the data that it uses is labeled by humans if it's supervised learning. And so it learns that. It's as simple as that. Now, to Samar's question of whether we can try to avoid it or whether we can change the kind of biases that it has, I think we are at the stage where the direction that technology development, especially in terms of artificial intelligence and machine learning, is taking, is that we are trying to teach it to do stuff. I think that's where this bias is coming in from, instead of trying to learn from it or co-create with the system. Because what happens is most of the applications that you see today use something called supervised learning, which implies that you tell the system what correct answer is or what the outcome is supposed to be. So if you have a system which classifies images, you tell the system that this image is a cat, you give hundreds of examples of it, and then the system is able to identify cats from other images. But there are other abilities that any such system can have, like unsupervised learning systems can cluster data. Now, if you cluster data, humans have a chance to learn of new ways to classify people, new parameters on which to classify people for any job or anything for that matter. Right. On the other hand, if we are aware of these biases as humans, we can do something to eliminate it. So there's this process called cleaning of data in data processing. And what we do is we remove things which are not relevant, like stop words like a and the, which do not add to the context of the meaning as much. And so if, in all honesty, if the gender is not relevant, it's as useless as a stop word. Right? So as Nidhi said, you can just clean it out. Just remove gender specific words because they don't matter. Right? It's not really relevant to the context that you are working in. And so you can just pre-process to remove externally the biases that you think can exist while ensuring they don't counter bias it to another new bias set altogether. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, just to quickly add to that, even with supervised learning, if you just provide a more balanced data set, that itself will eliminate so much of the bias. If, for example, in the US, there has been a history of racial discrimination, especially when it comes to incarceration. And so if we just blindly provide historical information of people that have been incarcerated, then obviously there will be a racial bias. But if you, as human beings, like figure out a way to balance the training data set to add additional context, then even with supervised learning, even with just simply teaching a machine, you can actually make the algorithm more fair.
Absolutely. I mean, absolutely. Whenever whenever that is possible, 100% yes. What I've noticed in the context of a lot of practical applications is that when you have millions of data points to get data off, it just becomes a tad bit more difficult to understand and recontextualize an entire data set which has million points, which is why for a lot of practical purposes companies just do it directly, right? Which makes it a tad bit more difficult. I mean, I would 100% agree with what you're saying, and that should be done. It's just that it's a little bit difficult to implement it in practicality, which is what makes a lot of this happen in the first place, I guess.
Exactly. And that's
Right?
where the need for regulation comes in, and that's where
Yeah,
the need for really emphasizing on fairness and ethics in AI is important.
absolutely. Yeah. I mean, even if we can't change the past, we can at least change it from the present, right?
Yeah, that was another pretty insightful discussion on the question. So, moving on to the next one. The COVID-19 pandemic has brought into focus misinformation spread through social media. As per you, what are some of the ways in which we can try to ensure reliable information, curb harmful information, while promoting the idea of free speech? Also, I feel that it is about time we hold the internet giants such as Google, Facebook, Twitter, etc., accountable for the misinformation that is spread on their platform. So, in your opinion, what are some of the ways in which we can do so?
Okay. Perhaps this idea of platforms versus people is something that allows a lot of blame to be shifted and therefore not be addressed. This idea that whether the platforms are responsible for misinformation or the people themselves, it's just like weapons. Are weapon manufacturers responsible for the deaths that happen, or the people who use those weapons? Right. So I am a firm believer that a platform versus millions of people using it, a platform is really difficult. I mean, it's a difficult job for a platform to regulate everything that happens on its platform, and that if people want, they can always find a loophole. So while they can practice policies that can help ensure that misinformation does not target, but I think in the end it almost becomes a responsibility of the people to do it. What happens is, have you heard of the term WhatsApp university by any chance? Like, it's a floating slang which means things that you can learn from WhatsApp, because WhatsApp shares so much, a lot of information is shared on WhatsApp, and that's what becomes a basis. A credential has been associated with it just because it has been shared on WhatsApp, while it does not have any basis whatsoever. Right now, there is a slight nuance in the wording. When you say WhatsApp university, you are associating the information that has been spread with WhatsApp. Well, WhatsApp has not done anything to that information. It's the people that have shared that information. So I would say People's Federation of WhatsApp University or something like that, because it's the people that are doing it. Right. And so I have this opinion that while these platforms can definitely take steps to promote awareness of what should and should not be done, I think the final control still lies, because as long as you are trying to promote the idea of free speech, you also are supposed to give people freedom. And that freedom is something that is exercised by people. So I think in that sense, my honest opinion is that platforms are meant as guidelines. Platforms can help people recognize that there are biases because they have this vantage point. Like a Twitter or a Facebook is going to know that a lot of people are showcasing this behavior or showcasing this bias, but they cannot make them change it as long as they do not want to change it themselves. So like to sum it up, platforms guide people vantage points, so they have a lot of information. The consumers are the ones who are supposed to implement it, is what I think.
I do agree that it is kind of a difficult balance to achieve, right? Between what people are saying, what the company is doing, and then also on a broader scale, what the government is doing. But I think it's also important to acknowledge that this is an interdisciplinary kind of question, because when you say misinformation, what exactly does that entail, right? Because somebody can go on the street and say that the earth is flat, or they can even say that on Twitter or Facebook, and that's not actually going to have any real world implications, and that is their opinion. And so it is, I guess, free speech, right? So where do you draw that line between something that can be potentially harmful, something that can incite violence, something that can push political propaganda, versus just an opinion that is wrong, or an opinion that is whimsical and doesn't make much sense? So there is an aspect of, I guess, philosophy and governance in this, and not just technology. But on the other hand, I do think that with certain subjects, like I said, with things that can have a harmful effect on other people, it is important to have guidelines and policies. For example, with the COVID pandemic, you see every time you post anything related to COVID on Instagram, there is kind of an information link that comes up, and it says that, okay, this is related to COVID. You might want to check this out. So with those kinds of things, it is important to have these kind of guidelines and have these kind of policies. But it is a more like nuanced question. And I think even if we do look at, let's say, organizations, fact-checking organizations, how do we know if they can be trusted, right? How do we actually decide which news is fake and which is not? Mm-hmm. So I think this is a much broader question. And before we actually go on to answer it and decide what to do about it, these questions and frameworks need to be answered and decided at the largest level, at the government level, right? So first, the government needs to build these kinds of frameworks. We need to decide what is actually harmful, what is okay. And then we can look at these tech organizations. Then we can look at Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and see whether they're complying with this. But I think it is a little difficult to just place the onus completely on them. So that's...
Yeah. Absolute. You got to trust is what I think. So absolutely right. I completely agree with you. One thing that I would like to point out specifically is that I believe what makes tech so specific in terms of why it becomes important is that there are phenomena that you can notice in social networks that are unique to social networks, right? Like echo chambers is a term that's specifically designed to denote a chamber of information that reflects unto itself. And what happens on social media is that you get a community of people who share similar opinions. The algorithms of social media get trained to give the opinions that they like, and therefore they're in this closed chamber of information where they only get the opinions that they want to hear, right? And social media and other such platforms have only amplified it, which is what makes this so unique. Is because while there were, like Nidhi mentioned specifically about people having opinions, and that's just an opinion. If you share it out in the world, that's free speech, it's your right? But what tends to happen is in social media, specifically, the moment these opinions are put out in the audience and in such an echo chamber, it gets reflected to become so massive that it can take even celebrities down in a lot of examples, right? So there's no one who's out of reach of these echo chambers and the opinions that are there, because they just cancel out. I like to give an example from an episode of South Park, which is not necessarily the most politically correct show out there on the internet, but I love how they use this idea that there was a girl in school who was all about, positive body image, that you should be happy with the way you look, right? And so she showed a guy how easy is it to Photoshop an image of yourself and make yourself look more beautiful. And so the moment the guy sees it, it's not like he understands that you can easily change or alter body images. He understands that it's that the girl that approached me for dating looks so beautiful in this image, so let me date her, right? And the important thing to note is that there's a mini echo chamber in here, because all the girls start doing it, and this girl, the moment she starts pointing it out, that the whole idea of this was to ensure that you understand that you should be comfortable with your body image, they say you are jealous, and the entire school cancels that girl out. Right? This is exactly the power that any social media group has. I'm not even saying the social media platform as a whole. The social media group has, which has such an impact that it needs to be addressed, or it's become so important today. Yeah.
Yeah. I agree with that, because it is powerful, right? And that is why it can also be a problem, because it actually even has the potential to incite wars, right? Or protests and things like that. So there definitely is a need to address it and think about it. But then in India specifically, like you rightly mentioned about, WhatsApp University, a lot of information that we get, or at least our parents get in that generation, comes from WhatsApp and comes from forward. So for example, WhatsApp has done a couple of things to at least mitigate this, which is they place a limit on the number of people you can forward a message to. And they've, when a message is forwarded, it's very obvious that it's forwarded. When it has been forwarded multiple times, that also is very evident. But the issue with WhatsApp is that it's end-to-end encrypted. It's your private messages. Would you be okay with them being fact-checked? Would you be okay with a company having access to your personal messages? So that is largely unexplored, and it's because they are personal messages and it is difficult to keep a track of. But I think that is a space where we need to explore it further, and we need to understand how this can be harmful and how this can be mitigated, especially in India.
Yeah,
right. Absolutely agree. So do you think that a distinction should be made between an opinion and a fact? For example, if I say I like somebody's music, that is my opinion. But however, if I make a factual statement such as vaccines cause autism, that is a factually incorrect statement. So now should we draw a distinction between those two? And where do we draw that line?
Okay, so this is a difficult question, right? Because a lot of people are atheists and don't believe in religion. And a lot of people believe that religion is fact, right? So if somebody says something about the religion that they practice or the God that they believe in, is that supposed to be counted as a fact or an opinion? Is that supposed to be fact checked? Like there are, yes, again, like for certain things like vaccine, it is important because it has serious repercussions and it has potential to be harmful. But if somebody says this person's music is bad, right? That is an opinion, but it's framed in a way that makes it seem like it's a fact. So where do you really draw this line? Where do you make that distinction of, okay, this person is stating a fact that is actually incorrect versus this person is stating an opinion? So I think even that there is a blurry line. I know that it is a little more straightforward, but there still is a blurry line there as well.
Yeah. To be honest, when I'm looking at a lot of the steps that are being taken by a lot of companies or a lot of discussions that are happening around this, I feel that a lot of them are, looking at whether we should look at people's data or not, whether all messages should be checked or not, which, as Nidhi correctly pointed out, if they are private messages, we might not want them to be checked, even if it's not a fact. I don't care. I just don't want my private messages to be read. It's as simple as that. What I feel is there exists an alternative method of going about it, which might work a little more in consensus with the people. And how I state that is that, think of it like this: if you are on a social media platform and you want to post something out, like a Twitter, right? And you post a message on it, why do we not let people say that I want this to be claimed as verified? Twitter has this verified tick mark, which adds a lot of value to a person's profile. Similarly, why can a fact checked message, which users consent to being fact checked because they are all right with that message, be given a tick or a verification, or the citation added to that point, simply because the user submitted that view to be fact checked? And this way, we don't have to go through this totalitarian idea like George Orwell's 1984 image, where everybody has some vision on top of them and they're like, Big Brother is watching us or something like that, right? So it does not need to go through this idea phase of whether every message should be checked or not. If we can just trust people a little more and say that as long as I provide a token that this is fact checked, just like an ISI mark or a gold ag mark, whatever that stuff is, which people look for when they are looking for whether it's a fact or not. And if people choose to accept a system like that, I think something like that can work without necessarily invading the privacy of every individual who does not necessarily want to enroll in it in the first place.
That's a really good point. And I think that could be one of the ways in which this is dealt with in the future. The other thing, and this is a more like policy level implementation, could be that if a tweet is liked or retweeted more than X number of times, then it can be subjected to verification. And same with Instagram or even WhatsApp. Like if a message has been forwarded 500,000 times, then it's clearly not a personal or private message. And I think then it can be fact checked or verified. So there could be certain interventions that don't necessarily, infringe on people's rights and like protect their privacy while still maintaining this larger sense of safety and security overall. So
yeah, that was a great discussion. So that's all the questions from my end, and now we'll move on to the questions posed by the audience on the meet on this Zoom call as well as on Y4Y. So now the first question says, do you think that the robots may replace human laborers? If yes, then how will it impact the economy of the country?
I think, it might not be a very well taken opinion, but I think it's possible that robots replace humans. Why not? It could be the next step in evolution. But that being said, that's just a fantasy. When you say about robots replacing human labor, that I believe comes from this idea that automation can replace humans and therefore have a lot of effect on how economy is working currently and how the economic cycles work, etc., etc. What I believe is that, yes, there are a lot of aspects of human work that could be replaced by machines or technological tools in the future. But if you look at history, there are a lot of things that there were a lot of think about transportation as a microcosm, like a small isolated field. Earlier there were a lot of humans employed in driving carts, driving bullock carts, horse carts, whatever transportation modes were there. As technology progressed, while there were a lot of jobs that were supposedly replaced in terms of who drives bullock carts or horse carts or takes people from one place to other, there were a lot of other avenues of more jobs created when cars started being built. Right. So from our perspective today, especially because it's a threat to a lot of people's occupations, it might feel like it is something that could replace people. But I think it could replace people and substitute them to a different place, is what I believe. So while there are a lot of tasks which humans do, which are repetition based, As long as there is technology and new technology being introduced, there are going to be new avenues for people to work at as well. There might be a phase in the transition period where a lot of people lose jobs because they are not exactly aware of what the system is working like till it reaches an equilibrium. But once it does, I believe that everyone's going to be settled. Not a problem.
Yeah, that's great. So moving on to the next question. As we know, IoT is helping us in different ways. So what all things do you think can be taken to improve the use of IoT more beneficial? Yeah, Nidhi, you can go ahead.
Jagrit, do you actually want to take this question?
Oh, sure. Yes. In terms of my exposure to Internet of Things, what I've recognized is that it is in this phase of technology when you are still exploring the possibilities, right? I mean, if you think about it, from a like the metric that I use to understand this is how different is the perspective of a developer as in whoever makes any product of Internet of Things, and the consumer. So at this point, for the developers, they are looking at technologies which could provide medicines at different points in time, edge computing, etc., etc. But for people, consumers, the perspective is Alexa, Google Home, right? When you look at Internet of Things and all devices being connected, and this dissonance in perspective of consumers and developers is a telltale sign of how the industry is still nascent, right? So the people who are developing things out of it are not necessarily doing it for the people, but they are doing it for the technology to be developed. So I think for Internet of Things to have a greater impact, it needs to grow out of this nascent stage into a phase where the developers are making things for the community, for the consumers, and therefore it becomes an open market which promotes itself. And the moment we reach that, that is when we can look at the question of how can it impact us, when will it impact us, and how much of an impact will it be.
Yeah, absolutely agreed. So because this industry yet has to cross that chasm of the early developers and the
exactly
the adopters that are going to adopt it.
Yeah.
Right. So the next question we'll take is this is with respect to our initial discussion that we had on data. So this one says the future cannot be built on faith, and that something stronger is required than faith. So what do y'all think? Because it is correct, because we can't really just hope that everybody will be accountable for the data. So.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. While we can expect people to be better and people to, not behave irrationally or recklessly, I think some people will do that. And there does need to be regulations in place, not just at a company level, but at the government level, at the international level. And that's why I think so far there has been a policy gap because technology has been moving at such a rapid pace, and policies take time to be implemented. Policies, there's a lot of other things that need to be done before policies can actually be implemented. So I think the way for the future would be, especially given that we live in such a data-driven world, we do so much prediction and analysis, we can actually try to look at what the future of AI will be in the next 5 years. And we can try to start building policy for that right now. So we can make sure that, for example, 5 years ago, if somebody had predicted that misinformation would be such a big problem, then we could have started to answer the questions about it right then. We could have built a strong policy framework by now so that this wouldn't be a problem anymore. So I think one thing is like looking towards the future and seeing how we can make it stronger. And the second is training government personnel and making them adept at technology and AI and algorithms so that they can actually build really useful policy, or they can look towards experts. But it is very important. And I think every country, every state really needs to look into this.
Yeah, yeah. In a sense, I completely agree with Nidhi when she says the government employees need to, be worked up towards getting an idea and I mean keeping up with times. I mean, it's simply in the nature. If you look at the Indian government, the average age of a politician is 53 years. Like, just think about it. People who are making policies for us, they have no clue of what technology is supposed to be like. So while it's not just about one minister, of course, because they can have a team of people who can expertly advise them, but what kind of a bill would be passed in a parliament where more than 90% of the people are above the age of 40, who had spent most of their lives when smartphone was not even there. For them, computer is a big thing. It's a new thing. We are technologically advanced because we use computers, right? So this policy gap, number one, comes from the kind of constitution of the government itself. Now, while that is a bigger challenge to take because youth is not necessarily participating in politics actively because of a certain image that is associated with it or not showing interest in general, but one, as long as youth do not take interest in policy making itself, I don't think it is going to have a major impact in terms of the change that we can bring. And therefore, everybody who's watching this and the youth who are going to listen to this, I urge you to take more interest in policies and how the artificial intelligence systems are working or how tech is working in general, because we need you. We require you to step in to help make these policies better. Yeah.
Yeah, right. I guess we can take one last question before we wrap up. So this question is: although big companies have the budget and the expertise to maintain data security, yet they remain susceptible to data breaches. For example, Twitch, Azure have been in the news recently. So, what could be an approach maintaining status of ethical and privacy preserving and take care of these issues? So, yeah, because Twitch, the entire source code got leaked, right? It's like a huge
Yeah.
leak.
Yeah,
Like
Nidhi,
it's the
did
biggest
you?
open source company ever.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think so. Ultimately, companies, their major aim is profits, right? They want to maximize their profits, and to be very honest, their main aim is not to preserve your privacy or to ensure that your data is safe. Um, so one thing that comes to mind is having, of course, having more systems in place. So, for example, I don't know how many of you are aware of auditing in financial systems, but to make sure that there's no fraud in companies, extensive audits of their balance sheets, of their cash flows, are taken by external organizations every single year. And this is mandated by the government, right? So, because of that, we have more faith in companies' financial statements. We have more faith in financial systems in general. And so I do think that security systems, algorithms, all of these need to be audited by external organizations, and this needs to be mandated. It's not just something that can be optional anymore, right? This is the need of the hour. And so I think systems like that really need to be set in place.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I think so. In terms of when people say big companies have a lot of money, I think their scale is the only thing that has grown. So their expenses have grown, their problems have grown, and their money has grown. So as Nidhi absolutely rightly said, it's the economics still remains similar, right? You're looking for profiteering, you're looking at how you can preserve your money, how you can preserve your interests, and in the process, like philanthropy, look at data privacy as things which needs to change. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, so I guess we are running out of time now, so I'll wrap up. So this was an exhilarating and a very informative discussion with all of you. This was really nice. And as we conclude, I'd like to thank both of you, Nidhi and Jagrit, for taking up the time to have such an excellent discussion with us. Also, a huge thank you to our viewers. We hope that we helped you to gain a deeper insight into the ethical aspect of technology. I know that unfortunately, due to shortage of time, we could not really, take all the questions, but we did try our level best to take as many as we could. And yeah, So the next event is Safety and Security Online, and it starts 10 minutes from now. So be sure to join in using the agenda at over. Thank you.